Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show of the Western Standard. It's Thursday, May the 9th, May the 8th. Joining us now is David Knight Legg, and he's no stranger to the Western Standard and this show. Good to have you back, David.
Great to be here.
It's David. Newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney has just returned from paying his respects to U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, we usually introduce you by turns as a strategic advisor to the Alberta government and also to into the energy industry. You saw what we all saw on with Mr. Carney. How would you have advised his advisors if you had been given the chance before he went to what appeared to be a friendly but unproductive meeting?
Well, I know a couple of his advisors. One of the best advisors that he has is former Ambassador David Knight,
yes,
who was the man who actually saved the USMCA from Chrystia Freeland's complete fumbling of that. And actually, the president mentioned that at the time. So I think one thing to keep in mind about that meeting, whenever you advise somebody, you have to look at the context, the audience, and what you want out of the discussion. Those are the three key things. And that is a tough audience. You've got the American public watching. If you want to see how not to play it, and I'm not sure that, I'm sure Zelensky's advisors would have actually saw a picture of Zelensky's advisors when that meeting happened, that absolutely epic meeting between J.D. Vance, Zelensky, and the president. And I saw the advisor actually put their head in their hands, and so I'm not sure that it was his advisors that fumbled the ball as much as Zelensky. And I have deep sympathy. A lot of people go into these meetings sleep deprived. Everything that they are hoping for hangs in the balance, and the U.S. president has extraordinary power. And this U.S. president uses that power for tactical advantage. So let me say this. I think that he was well advised. There is, in the Twitter universe, which is never a good read on reality, but in the Twitter universe, there's a lot of people that say that he, elbows down, kissing the ring, how embarrassing, and what a contrast to the way that he ran the campaign on this elbows up kind of, I think sadly geriatric version of a defensive posture, frankly. After a decade of weakening the economy under a Liberal Party that had left the cupboard bare. So I think when you go into a meeting with the president and he has most of the cards, you play it the way that he played it, which is to be as diplomatic and charming as possible and to reassert the friendship, especially following this election. Here's what I find ironic about that, though. Stepping back from advising his team, I'm sure his advisors laugh thinking about me being in their cohort. But what I find ironic about that is that one of the best single advocacy strategies of the past 3 months in the United States that has had the most effect of the people that I know, and as you know, I was down at the inauguration, we talked about some of those dynamics,
yes,
was Danielle Smith's spade work, in making sure the Americans knew we were their friends, but also making sure that they knew the fact base over and against things the president said out loud, like that they don't need our energy. She knows that's false. She knows that's a strategic talking point or negotiating tactic, but she's addressed that very effectively with almost every member of that cabinet, and they all know the fact base around Canadian energy. What I find unbelievable about the current situation is that our mainstream media played along with this temptation by some, particularly in the East, to treat the advocacy work that Danielle Smith was doing as some sort of betrayal of the country, because she was directly representing actually the industries that are under her purview, which is energy, which also happens to be the lion's share and the most important proportion of the export GDP that the country has with the Americans. She's been doing it for 3 months. She did a phenomenal job of standing up for all of Canada and making the point again and again that the $200 billion surplus is actually a result of energy, not a result of the other trade factors. And she did all the work, but she got very little credit. And when you see Mark Carney doing what I think is the right thing, and as a huge contrast to the way that he ran the campaign, very much kissing the ring and being a charmer, which I think is fine and part of the job. The same Eastern mainstream press that was calling out Danielle Smith for a much more reserved and frankly a much more definitive defense of Canada again and again in the engagements that I saw, Mark Carney gets a free pass, and she doesn't get hailed as somebody that's really stood up for the country. I think the double standard going on in the way that we approach the Americans, this White House, and the economic questions is extraordinary. And I think the Liberal Party has to answer for that. And I think that the current negotiations between the Prime Minister and particularly Danielle Smith, who I see as the emerging counterpart to the Prime Minister in the Canadian political spectrum right now, even more so than Pierre Poilievre in this moment, is going to be structured around more and more of an admission that she is standing up for the industry that has the only hope of giving Canada an economic momentum.
Well, let's go to that. Ted Morton, you would be very familiar with Ted Morton, and certainly our readers are. You had what I thought was an important article in the Western Standard yesterday, in which he was drawing attention to the commonality of interest, surprisingly, between Mark Carney and Danielle Smith. And the way he reasoned it, I'm probably bastardizing his argument, but it's a long one.
Ted will forgive you for that. Maybe.
Well, what he's saying is that, all right, we have our point of view out west here, and it's very well articulated, I think, by Premier Smith. Meanwhile, here we have a newly elected prime minister. He has walked in. It won't be a surprise to him. The mess of the economy that's been made was made at a time when he was closely involved with advising the outgoing Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who famously wasn't really interested in the economy. And so now he's looking at a bare cupboard. And there are things that he wants to do, but he needs money to do them. And in fact, has already committed to what I think is an outrageous $250 billion borrowing campaign. Inflation, more inflation, here we come.
Yeah.
He needs to make some money. What could be better? And Alberta wants to get his energy industry moving again.
Yeah.
Is there a commonality of interest which could actually take the country forward?
Yeah. It's called going back to the constitutional structure of Canada as a federation of independent provinces that have the autonomy to build their industries because they're closest to those industries. Ottawa does not understand the energy industry. Never has. That's been part of the narrative, the grand sort of narrative of the country. But the country is unified by John A. Macdonald in response to what he saw as the obvious territorial absorption of Canada if we didn't do something to create pan-Canadian industrial commerce. And the federalist structure that Canada has is built differently from the United States, and the provinces have far more power than an American state has. We're built on a different set of assumptions. And it's been a decade of the Liberal Party of Canada working against the constitutional architecture of the country, the way that it was intended to run. And when you look at Premier Smith's 4 demands, those 4 demands are effectively saying, we want the federal government to just stick to the constitutional architecture as it exists and as it's understood and has been understood, aside from this interregnum of this last 10 years of climate alarmism driving deeply uneconomic decisions, deep debt spending, consistent deficits. And I think that what's happened...
Mr. Carney was all about all this stuff, though.
Mr. Carney backed the idea of deficit spending. He has an instinctive Keynesian approach, like a lot of technocratic, bureaucratic people do.
He's also greener than the carpet here. It's
well, he's been mugged by reality. You cannot.
Has he really been mugged, or is he just saying what he needs to say?
You can open the national balance sheet and look at it and see any plausible way that you're getting out of the current economic crisis that his government, under his advice for the last 5 years, has painted the country into, without realizing that the only seriously large global asset base is energy. The number 2 export GDP that we've got, and we're a very export-driven country, 77% of all our exports go to the United States. He's already said this is an existential crisis. But it's deeply existential if you make cars, which can be replicated in the United States. We don't have a homegrown industry. These are secondary plants for American producers. If you make aluminum, which depends on bauxite, which all comes from the United States, right? We have a set of rolling crises that are coming out of this Trump trade negotiation where he's very serious about reshoring a lot of industries from around the world. And a lot of those industries are targets in Canada right now. One industry that is not a target, because it can't be a target because it is so autonomous, is energy. And Canada is a global energy superpower. And when Mark Carney got into the campaign, he realized very quickly that in order to run a campaign that would be effective for all Canadians, you needed to sound, talk, and act like a conservative. So he very quickly adopted core conservative platforms, including what was the previous ballot question, which is the carbon tax, conceded that immediately. The next question was anybody with just introductory economics 101, realizing that we're the worst in the OECD all of a sudden, except for one other country, on capital gains, let alone our productivity, which we're also worst in the OECD, had to immediately reverse that. So after you adopt enough conservative policies, you start thinking to yourself, if the consensus between me as a liberal leader running for prime minister and my adversary, Pierre Poilievre, is basically that I need to adopt as many parts of his platform as I can to start reversing this lost decade, then you start thinking hard, and you're putting yourself on track to start to realize that there is no option but to start to go down the path of what Alberta is asking for. Premier is not asking, the mainstream media is using this language of demands. She's not making demands. She's asking that the federal government go back to the original structure of Canadian federalist architecture, period. There's no special demands. There's nothing unique about what she's asking for. She wants tidewater access. That should be obvious. She wants there to be a reduction of these insane regulations that are contradicting the Constitution and moving federal jurisdiction into provincial jurisdiction. She wants there to be a suspension of the idea that we use export taxes as an additional form of tax against energy, right? These are baseline expectations of an open, free democracy.
Now, those demands, which aren't demands, but those, the 4-point program that she's laid out and said, this is what we need to do. There was actually 9 points, and I think she's edited them down to 4.
Yeah.
But it's based on, or is congruent with a letter that the industry put out.
Yeah.
I think there might have been some 38.
38 CEOs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Your research is better than mine. 38 CEOs of major Alberta energy companies.
Yeah.
Who said, this is what's going to happen. Can you talk about that letter and relate it to what the Premier is saying? And then I'm going to take you to Mr. Carney's forthcoming visit to the West.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to see he's doing that. The letter is written well worth reading for your viewers. The letter is very specific. That the context of this letter is in 2015, the energy industry, new charismatic young Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came in, made some nice sounds about cooperation and governing one Canada. The industry listened to him. The industry was responsive to saying, look, we've done a lot for the environment. We can be consistent with your climate goals, your environmental goals, and the development of energy and this economy. We're going to work with you. We're going to form a collaborative approach to you and to the new government, and we're going to prove that this is one country and we can achieve these things and not make a false choice between energy, the environment, and economic growth. Well, fool me once, right? That same energy, many of the same leaders that were there during that period are not going to let that happen again. It's a decade later. They're a decade smarter. They've been through one of the toughest periods in the energy industry. They got no love from Ottawa during that period. Any other industry in this country catches a cold, and Ottawa is quick to try and find capital to support them. The energy industry is constantly at war with bureaucrats that are operating under this liberal NDP framework of climate alarmism, which is not scientific. It's deeply ideological. And now they know it. So what's happened with that letter is Mark Carney is now seeing the books, being mugged by reality.
You don't think he saw the books in the last 5 years?
I think he saw the books, but I don't think he was prime minister. It's more fun to be an advisor than to actually have to lead.
Yeah.
But now he's got to walk into a room and actually take decisions. He's got to go down and deal with the U.S. president that's about to hollow out several of the core industries in the East. If you ask the street, How do you think Canada's auto industry is going to do? How do you think Canada's steel and aluminum industry is going to do? It's a cold shower. This is not a happy time for core industries in Canada. But if you look at our agriculture, you look at our energy, you look at our fisheries, you look at our timber, you look at our mining, the potential we have for mining, the key impediment that you see to the rapid development of those industries and our ability to go global with those industries is 100% and only Ottawa. There is no one else in the world is imposing restrictions on Canada except for the federal government in Ottawa. And so what those 38 CEOs have said in different terms is, we are CEOs of an industry that is totally global. We are CEOs that operate around the world all the time. These are massive, massive companies, the biggest in Canada, aside from the banks. And we are telling you that you need to make these 8 changes. And if you don't make those 8 changes, it's not going to work. You're not going to have an economy. And I think what's happening is when the captains of industry are starting to take the gloves off, they hate doing this, by the way. They're not by nature. They've chosen a private sector.
Just tell me what the rules are.
They're playing contact sports in the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't sign up for the Machiavellian shades of gray around how you manage politics. But as they engage with politics, they are now coming in with gloves off, and they're making it very clear. We're telling you what you need to do. And these 38 CEOs, if you stack up the assets that those 38 CEOs command and control in this country, as the prime minister, you better take it deadly serious, because this is not a time for anything but complete realism. The good news for Mark Carney, having been mugged by reality, is this is paint by numbers. You can do all 8 things that those CEOs ask for. You can do all 4 things that Premier Smith has asked for. And it doesn't cost anyone else in Canada a thing. It only grows the economy for everybody. It only grows the tax base for everybody. It only secures a more confident and happy and collaborative and integrated federation. He's got to manage Quebec separatism, which is longer in the tooth and has a much stronger cultural element to it. Alberta instincts for independence, I wouldn't say separatism, and we can talk about that, but Alberta's instincts for independence are born completely over the fact that this province carries the rest of the country, and over the fact that Ottawa refuses to recognize that, talk about it, or represent that in the way that they negotiate on these issues. And so I think the game has changed. Danielle Smith is clearly stating things that people in her constituency are saying to her. Between 25% and 35% of the province, depending on who's measuring it and the kind of question they ask, are today saying we would rather pursue an independent version of Alberta outside the current structure.
So let me just ask you about that. I mean, that's quite wide, but how deep is it? When we were talking, when you see your team lose a game, and that's it, I'm done. And then we'll go back there next week for another game. So how is that anger got enough horsepower to actually take it somewhere?
Well, I think you never want to be held prisoner by your analogy. I think that the idea of separation is an odd idea when it comes to geography. Alberta can't move anywhere. There has to be ties. I think that what people are expressing, I think there is disappointment, not necessarily specifically around the electoral outcome. I think that the issue is that a lot of people feel that there's a set of assumptions that were made in the last 10 years out of Ottawa that are just so wrong-headed. They're anti-scientific. They're deeply ideological. They don't reflect a Canadian consensus. They reflect a very narrow base of a liberal NDP left consensus on a false trade on energy and the environment. Mm-hmm. And in light of that, they're saying, well, if this is going to persist, and the problem for Prime Minister Carney is you've got a picture of him, and then behind him it's like a lineup of the usual suspects of everybody that did damage in very specific ways to the Alberta and the federal economy.
And talk down to us.
Yeah. But they talk down because they're insecure. They're at odds with, they can play these domestic politics, but they're at odds with the rest of the globe. And this is what the press doesn't do a good enough job, to my mind, holding them account to. Canada has fallen on every index you can possibly look at. We've just collect crime way up, drug trade way up, criminal and terrorist cartels operating fully well-known laundering operations way up. reversals on almost every major economic criteria. At worst in the G7 the last 5 years, worst in the OECD on the productivity trend to 2030 out to 2060. They're using weaselly talking points like net GDP to it's net debt to GDP, which is a fake talking point. That people are tired of it, but the rest of the world looks at this and just says, we could just ignore Canada because it's its own version of a basket case. It doesn't make any sense. It's deeply politically correct. It's deeply morally self-righteous, but they want to be self-righteous in hotspots in the world, but they don't fund their military and they don't show up. They don't do the job. They want to be self-righteous to the Americans of what's happening, but they've got a fentanyl crisis that's killed 50,000 young people in Canada in 10 years, and they pretend that it's not a crisis. And they give lectures to the Americans on only finding 45 kilograms of fentanyl crossing the border when we crush one super lab and it's got more than that sitting on one counter.
Yeah.
So I think the country has to reckon with the fact that we are not going to turn our economic situation around without global capital saying Canada started to get its act together. And for the new prime minister, the best way to do that is listen to the 38 CEOs that are in the one industry that is most global, that is most accessible to global capital, that can double itself in the next 5 to 10 years, and that can continue to fund the rest of the country. And then take away all these green rules that are not imposed in other countries that also care about climate, against agriculture, against mining, against forestry, and against energy. And we'll start to see this economy turn around, and we'll have enough cash flow to fund the things that we have as priorities without needing to borrow another $250 billion and pass $2 trillion of debt on to our kids.
Almost out of time, David, which is highly regrettable, but I need to take you back to your advisor role. Mr. Carney has arranged a meeting with the premiers in, I believe it's in Saskatoon on June the 2nd.
Yeah.
This is obviously reaching out to the Western premiers and Western voters. What should his message be in that meeting?
Look, I think his number one message should not wait for that meeting.
Yep.
I think that this temptation by the federal government to try and create theatrical moments of being beneficent to the West is tiresome. It makes no sense at all. Danielle Smith needs a deal team, and please make that deal team people from private industry that have some people from her cabinet on it. Do not make that deal team government bureaucrats and only politicians. We've got extraordinary people that know how to run deals. They need to be a part of this process. But she needs a deal team. He needs a deal team. They need to get this done. But for Mark Carney, it should be easy. Almost everything that's being asked for is a simple return to constitutional-based federalism that unleashes these markets and energy. The biggest issue that Mark Carney has is not the premiers that he's going to meet in Saskatoon. It's this very small, extremely activist base out of mostly Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa that are deeply committed to green alarmism that has set the country back by a decade. And it's been reflected in his own public statements about every business needs to show me that they believe in going to a net zero transition by 20. These things are no longer, no one believes this anywhere else. And it's led him down the wrong path in terms of economic development and growth. It's also meant Canada's been completely out of the picture in terms of shipping cleaner energy into the coal-fired economies of India and China. So for him to create a grand strategy, I don't think it should wait for moments like this, where there's sort of this formal theater. They should get to work. There should be one-on-one phone calls. There should be two deal teams meeting. There should be discussions about whatever the issues are that constrain Alberta. Alberta is ultimately going to start to ask for the same deal Quebec has. We can fund our own pension for about 6%, right? We don't need to be funding it at the same level that they cross-subsidizes other parts of the country. We can take care of our law enforcement, no problem, right? We've got all the capacity and more than enough economic firepower to completely run Alberta separately in the same manner that Quebec does. That's a framework that works within the Federation as conceived by our founders. And that's a framework I think Mark Carney has to endorse. If he endorses that framework and gives Alberta more obvious autonomy, and he allows the 38 people that are actually running this economy and producing the wealth that will pay down that debt, and he's letting them expand 2x. He's going to do more for the planet by allowing that LNG to get out to the coal-fired parts of the planet, but he's also going to do more for this country. And that shouldn't wait for any more grand announcements.
You know, he's known that for a long time. Let's hope that he's had this Damascus Road experience when he opened the books and said, oh my goodness, you know, now this can't go on. We are out of time, David, but once again, I find your insights just amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the program, and pleasure. Do it again soon.
Okay, look forward to that.
All the best.
Okay, thank you.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.